Forgive me if I'm a little froggy this morning. I'm still trying to get over a cold. We can blame that on Detroit. Anyways, it's good to be back from Detroit. I do not have to go back to Detroit this week. So that's, I don't know. It's a blessing in disguise. I do have to go down to Florida. So we'll see what Florida's like. We'll see how much water they've still left down there. All right, so last week, actually 2 weeks ago, we finished up Acts chapter 24. Last week, we started Acts chapter 25. Let's see if we got our clicker. Yeah, it's on. All right, so we started Paul's trial before Festus. We finished up the discussion about his time before Felix, and we started the discussion on his time before Festus. We got through the first 12 verses. We talked about how Festus came to power, and how he replaced Felix. It was about AD 60. Felix was sent back to Rome for trial for some of the things he had done while he was in power there in Palestine. How Festus had gone up to Jerusalem, and then he had come back to Caesarea. He was getting to know the local folks who were in charge there in Jerusalem, since it was a major city in the area. And how he brought Paul back with him. And Paul was brought before Festus immediately, and how the Jews who were in charge in Jerusalem hadn't forgotten about Paul. They were just as anxious to have him put to death as they were 2 years before. So they go back, and they still continue to charge him with things that he hadn't done. And Paul continued his defense, saying, I haven't done anything against the law of the Jews or the temple or even against Caesar. So then he's basically given an ultimatum. You want to go to Jerusalem? We realize it's kind of like parents telling or asking their children, hey, would you do this? Whether it's a chore or where they're not really given a choice. So anyways, we talked about why Paul was not acquitted by Festus, the different reasons, how he was going to be forced to go up to Jerusalem if he had not appealed to Caesar. But he did, and we talked about the reasons why he did so, and what his mentality may have been like, what he said versus what he may have been thinking, speculation as to what he was thinking, but it's possible that we've got similar ideas up there as what he was actually thinking. So, there we go, okay. And the last thing we talked about were possibly some of the benefits that Paul enjoyed because of his appeal. How he got to stay, because of King Agrippa's arrival, how he remained under Roman protection, how he later influenced Caesar's household and others. So this week, we begin with King Agrippa's arrival. So, who was King Agrippa? Well, before we do that, let's actually read the text. If you want to follow along with me, Acts chapter 25, we're going to start in verse 13, and I'm going to read down through verse 21. So beginning in verse 13, it says, After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, It is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face, and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. So that's our text, our beginning text for this morning. So we wanted to talk about initially, who was this King Agrippa? Any ideas? He went by another name, one that's probably more familiar, although it's more generic. Does the name Herod sound familiar? So he was one of the Herods. He was he was actually in an adjacent territory. If we go to the next slide here. Okay, so I have to look back. I'm looking at the Greek. Where is my... Okay, so we see Jerusalem. We see Caesarea up here. This is where Paul was at the moment. And this area of Samaria was in the central part of the map on the west side of the Jordan River. Judea was down. Where was King Agrippa from? King Agrippa II. His father was King Agrippa I. Any ideas where he might have been from? No? All right. So you see this whole area up here. This is where Galilee was. You see Nazareth, you see Capernaum. Caesarea Philippi, that was the capital of the Galilean province. So, and then there's also what's called Perea over here on the east side of the Jordan River. So King Agrippa II was the king over Galilee and over Perea. And he comes from Caesarea Philippi down to Caesarea. It's important not to get those two confused. Anyways, from Caesarea Philippi down to Caesarea, it's just by itself. So he comes down, and let's see what's our next slide say. Okay, so we talk a little bit more about Agrippa. So he was a Jewish leader. Many of the Romans had taken over different parts of Palestine. You've got Festus that we're talking about now. We've got Felix. We've got Roman commanders in Jerusalem. But King Agrippa II was actually Jewish. And he was also called the last of the Herods. He was of Drusilla. We mentioned Drusilla 2 weeks ago. She was the wife of Felix. And it's believed he was in his early 30s, 31, 32 years old at this time, give or take a year. So he was still a young man. He was given, even though I don't have my map up. Anyways, even though Jerusalem was not in his jurisdiction, he was still, I don't know if it was because he was of the family of Herod, or if there was some other reason, but for some reason he had the responsibility of protecting the temple in Jerusalem, even though it wasn't in his jurisdiction. He was also the one who was tasked with choosing who the high priest would be when one retired or died or could no longer, for one reason or another, fulfill his responsibilities. Herod Agrippa II had that responsibility. More about him. He lived in open sin with another sister. Now, it's mentioned here that he came down, in verse 13 it says, King Agrippa and Bernice. Her real name was Julia Bernice. She was married at an earlier age to another king. He died. She married another one of the Herods. I can't remember if it was an uncle or a cousin. Anyways, another one of the lesser-known Herods. He died. She comes back to Jerusalem, and she and her brother have an affair. And then when the affair starts, rumors start, so of course they want to cover up the rumors, so she actually marries somebody, moves out of Jerusalem, but it's not very long before she comes back, and they both decide, you know what, we don't care what the rumors say. So they're living openly in sin with one another, and that's the kind of relationship that Paul was going to be faced with. So, you think a king comes to see a governor. Well, the governor, since he's the host, he's going to be hospitable. And because he's hosting a king, he's going to be extra hospitable. Well, Festus was very hospitable in welcoming King Agrippa, but it wasn't because he was outranked. King Agrippa was a king. He had a smaller territory, and therefore he was outranked by a governor. I think there was one other thing on this. Yes. So, because he was Jewish, because he was from that area, he was considered I guess, the unofficial resident expert in Jewish religion. So he comes down, kind of like, let's say, the governor of Missouri. There's an election in Illinois, and they elect a new Republican governor. Now, who are we kidding? That would never happen. Let's say Kansas instead. I looked them up. They have a Democratic governor. Let's suppose that there's hope for Kansas, and they elect a Republican governor. So Missouri state governor goes over to the Kansas state governor and says, "Hey, how are you doing? This is how we do things in Missouri. You need any help? I'm always available." This is kind of the visit that King Agrippa was coming down, welcoming him, offering any assistance, just getting to know him a little better. Let's see, what have we got next? There we go. Okay, so we talked about who King Agrippa was, then the discussion that occurs between Festus and Agrippa. So the question is, when had the Jews asked for the death sentence? If we read in, well, it's not initially in verse 13. If you read in verse 15, the chief priests and the elders informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him, speaking about Paul. He's summarizing. He hasn't gone into all the details yet, but in verse 16 it says, "To them I answered, it's not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before," and then he gives out a couple of prerequisites. So the Jews had asked Festus, when he goes from Caesarea up to Jerusalem, they'd asked him, "Hey, he's still in jail. You've got him. Just be done with it. Put him to death, and we'll all be happy." But his initial reaction was what? No, not so, okay? What did the Roman law state concerning an accused man? It stated that the prisoner has rights. I was watching A Few Good Men, and there's a scene closer to the end of the movie where the accused actually admits he did. He doesn't believes that he had the authority to do it, but according to the law, he did not. The lawyer realizes, okay, he's admitted to doing something against the law. He turns around and he tells the judge the prisoner has rights, or the witness has rights. In this case, it was a prisoner. So the Festus tells Agrippa II that I couldn't allow him to simply be put to death because, number one, he didn't have a chance to face his accusers, and number two, he didn't have a chance to defend himself. So that's what, those are at least two things that we've copied in Western society from ancient Roman practices. So then the next question is, what was Festus's attitude toward the case? Was he like his predecessor, Felix? What did Felix do? Felix wasn't sure exactly what to do, but he kind of put it on a back burner and said, you know what, I'm just going to let him sit, and it'll keep the Jews out of my hair, it'll keep Paul out of my hair, and I can get on with living whatever kind of lifestyle I want to live. This was not the attitude that Festus had. There were three things that were noted. Number one, Felix acted immediately. If you read in verse 17, it says, therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. So he's expeditious. He's not going to let Paul sit in jail when there's no reason why he shouldn't. So he brings him in, and he's going to act on the matter. But then he realizes, well, this is not a matter for Roman law. This is a matter for Jewish law. This is not something that I'm an expert on. This is not something that I should even be making a decision on. He was surprised by the charges. In verse 18, it says, when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I suppose, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So he's got he's got the question of, well, is Jesus dead? Is he alive? And what does that mean to me? What does it matter to me? And then questions about the Jewish religion in general. So he acts immediately. He's surprised when the charges are brought. He was being held, since he had appealed to Caesar. They couldn't do anything more with him officially, judicially. So he's being held until arrangements can be made for him to be shipped off to Rome. This is when Agrippa arrives, and Agrippa, if we read in verse 22, says, "Then Agrippa said to Festus," after he's been introduced by Festus to all the circumstances of this case, in verse 22 it says, "Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself." The point is made in some of the notes that Agrippa II would probably not have volunteered to go to Paul, to listen to Paul, perhaps because it was beneath his dignity, beneath his office, perhaps because he didn't want to show that he was actually interested in what Paul had to say. But since he was there on a political mission, and Paul was already there, might as well not waste the opportunity. So he says, yeah, I'm willing to hear him. Let's see. What was the next one? Okay, so we talked about his relation to the other Herods. His father, Agrippa I, was the one who had James, the apostle, killed. His uncle, Herod Antipas, was the one who had killed John the Baptist. And then his great-grandfather, Herod the Great, I guess the first of all the Herods, was the one who tried to kill all the infants 2 years old and under in an attempt to kill Jesus. So that's his relation to the other Herods that had come before him. The question then is, had Agrippa heard of Paul before this occasion? How old did I say Agrippa II was at this point in time? 32, very early 30s, somewhere between 30 and 32. So what year are we in? AD what? Do you remember? I hear it. Somebody's whispering it. 60, okay, so AD 60. So we think he was born around AD 30. What happened around AD 30? This is an easy one. This is a softball. What happens around AD 30? Jesus is crucified, okay? So the two did not live, if they lived in the same time period, it was only for a year or 2 or 3. But as Jesus was going to the cross, Agrippa, if Agrippa had been born, was still an infant. So he did not have the chance to hear Jesus himself, but he did live in an area where Jesus preached. He did live in an area where the apostles, who after Jesus had been crucified, continued to preach. The church grew and continued to grow, and it was beginning to become an influence in the area. And so it's very likely that he had heard of Jesus. It's very likely that he had heard of Christianity. It's just that he was too young to have been there when it all got started. So, how did Festus react to Agrippa's desire to hear Paul? Did he blow off Agrippa, saying, this is really not something you need to worry about? No, it's just a local matter. It's just a small thing. It's a leftover from the previous administration. No, that's not what he said. He's up to his ears here. He's already met the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. He's got his hands full taking on a new administration. He's recently moved to the area, so he's still learning about perhaps area-specific customs and traditions. Now he's got this to deal with on top of it. Thank you, Felix, for leaving this in my lap. So his reaction was, if Agrippa wants to hear him, and if Agrippa is willing to give me something that I can write to Rome about, when I send Paul on, I'm all for it. All right, so let's go ahead and let's read the end of the chapter, beginning in verse 23. Acts chapter 25, beginning in verse 23, so it says, so the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus's command,
Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my lord concerning him. Therefore I brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. He's kind of oversimplifying it. He was required by law to send a written record of the proceedings that had taken place up to that point. But he's, I guess, in a way, paying homage to King Agrippa, saying, hey, if you can help me with this letter, I'd appreciate any help you can give me. So anyways, the question is, what kind of a gathering was this? This was a very, a formal gathering in the sense that there was a lot of attention paid to the order in which people came in, the attention that was given to everybody, who was present, kind of like a who's who, not a formal judicial hearing. This was an unofficial hearing. The appeal had been made to go straight to Caesar, so this was simply for Festus's benefit and in writing the letter, and for Agrippa's benefit that he could actually hear Paul at his own request. So formal in the sense that there were commanders there. There were, from what I read, there were 5 cohorts of Roman soldiers there in Caesarea, and so each of them had a commander, so there would have been 5 commanders in the room, in the, I don't know if it was a throne room, in a receiving room, whatever room they were in, some kind of a hearing room perhaps. So there were at least the 5 Roman commanders. There was Festus, there was Agrippa, his sister, wife, girlfriend, whatever you want to call her, Bernice. And then it talks about the important King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, the commanders and the prominent men of the city. It's believed that those were civil leaders. They could have been Jewish, they could have been Gentile, but they were civil leaders in the local government. So they were brought in to help kind of round out the meeting. So that's who all was, what kind of gathering this was, and who was with Agrippa. And then we talk about, did Festus say that they had found Paul guilty of the charges? What did he say? I heard somebody. No, they had not found him guilty. Had they found him innocent? No, they hadn't done that either. So we're kind of still at a stalemate here. This is like Felix round 2. So no, we haven't found him guilty. I didn't have a chance to take him back up to Jerusalem because he appealed to Caesar before I could do that. So this is where we are, Agrippa. So Festus's dilemma was, what was Festus's dilemma? Was he an expert in Jewish religion? No. Agrippa was. So he's asking for Agrippa's help. He can't send Paul to Rome without a letter explaining why he's being sent, but Agrippa doesn't really understand the ins and outs of Jewish law, and so he doesn't know what to write. If he doesn't send him, then he's violating Paul's rights to appeal, and he's probably displeasing the Jews. They want to see this continue forward as much as possible so that they can get a conviction on Paul. So he's caught between his own Roman law and he's caught between Jewish law, and so he's asking Agrippa for help. He says, Festus, Festus, with a touch of oratory, assembled, it had been observed that little men in big offices love the pomp and display that they think dignify their small souls. Undue pomp and display are usually signs of a weak or disintegrating power. True power needs no display. The higher the office, the less display is needed. Okay, so, yes, Ed. Not, why do you think he said not deserving? Why do you think he brought that specifically out? Because that's what the Jews initially asked for. And when they couldn't get that, then what did they do? They said, well, bring him where? To Jerusalem. Why did they want to do that? We'll kill him ourselves. We'll lay in wait. You know, we tried to do that 2 years ago. Didn't work out so good for us, at least for the 40 who had bound themselves to a vow. But you're right. You know, when they had the opportunity to ask that he be killed, they were turned down because he hadn't done anything worthy of death. You know. And you're right. You know, he didn't go so far as to say he's innocent, but he hasn't done anything worthy of death. So, good point. Any other points? Okay. So, what did Festus want from Agrippa? Said if Nero read between the lines that Paul had not gotten justice in Judea, which is one reason why people could appeal to Caesar if they felt like they were not getting justice in the lower courts. If Nero read between the lines that Paul had not gotten justice in Judea, many men, the Romans probably didn't observe Sunday as the Christians did. Anyways, if Nero's thinking, you guys have just screwed this all up, and I'm going to hold all of you responsible, now he's got a lot of folks to hold responsible because of what Festus has done. So Festus is kind of protecting himself in a sense here. If he could get a little help formulating a letter to Caesar that would sound reasonable, he would be able to remove himself from the case without harm to his position or reputation. Kind of like a hot potato. Nobody wants it. I'm going to toss it to the next person. Whoever's lap it lands in, I don't care as long as it's not in my lap. Says Festus hoped that this present attempt to gather additional information would bring out some fresh facts that he had not been able to grasp before. Someone as conversant with Jewish politics and religion as Agrippa would surely be able to help him understand what the case was all about and help him to put in writing something that would be a satisfactory introduction of the case to Caesar. That's how we finish chapter 25. Any comments or questions thus far? Okay, let's go on then. Let's read the first 3 verses of Acts chapter 26. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself, "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I'm accused by the Jews, especially because you are expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently." So we go on to the next screen. Paul's defense. Paul's permitted to speak. So what is the setting of this chapter? They're in, I don't know if it's a throne room, a hearing room, of some room that has been specially set aside, specially arranged with all sorts of important people, a lot of pomp and circumstance going on with all of the introductions. But the question is asked, who seems to have been in charge? Who was the governing authority in this area? We're in Caesarea. Who was the governor? Festus. But who was in charge of this hearing? I heard somebody whisper it. Agrippa, okay? It seems that Festus was only too happy to turn this over. Granted, this was not an official judicial proceeding, but he was happy to get any help he could from Agrippa. So it seems as though he turns it over because in verse 1, it's not Festus that tells Paul that he's allowed to speak, it's King Agrippa. If you go to the end of the chapter, or close to the end of the chapter, in verse 30, after Paul has finished speaking, it says, when he, Paul, had said these things, the king, Agrippa, stood up, as well as the governor and Bernice and those who sat with them, and then they step aside, and they They talk amongst themselves. It's not until the king stands up that the hearing is over. So the king starts it, the king ends it, so it appears that the king is the one who's actually in charge of this unofficial hearing. So we get into the next couple of verses. How many times is Paul's conversion story told in Acts? Well, there's a reason why they asked this question, so it can't be just once. Jimmy's got his hand up in the back. Jimmy's got 3 fingers up. Chapter 9, when it actually happens, when his conversion actually happens in real time. Acts chapter 22, when he's before Felix. And no, was it Felix? We'll go back. I forget. No, it's before he gets to Felix. When he's recounting on the steps outside of the Roman fortress, when he's recalling his conversion to the Jews who had tried to beat him to death because they thought he'd come out of the temple with a Gentile. So that's the second time, and now this is the third time that he's going to recount his conversion, this time before Agrippa. So the next question is, what new details are given in this account of his conversion? In Acts chapter 26, well, look at that. My Bible does not have the red letter edition. Anyways, in Acts chapter 26, I think it's beginning in verse 15, Paul actually recalls the actual discussion between himself and Jesus. They're on the road to Damascus. He says, he asks, "Who are you, Lord?" Jesus says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And then in verse 16 through 18, there are additional details given that are not covered in chapter 9 and that are not covered in chapter 22. It's mentioned that, if you go back to verse 14, it's mentioned that this voice, the voice of Jesus, spoke to him not in Latin, not in Greek, not in Italian, but in Hebrew. And he tells him it's hard for you to kick against the goads. But it's down in verses 16 through 18 that we get more detail about what was actually said between the two of them there on the road to Damascus. There are some things that are omitted. Turn the page here. Okay. The accounts in chapters 9 and 22 both mentioned Ananias. There's no mention of Ananias here in chapter 26. Both accounts in chapters 9 and 22 mention the fact that Paul had been blinded by this light. He doesn't mention the blindness here in chapter 26, but it does contain a fuller account of Paul's commission. Beginning in verse 16, it says, he's commanded, "But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me." Now, if Luke condensed this down, there may be condensed verses 16 through 18 down, there may have been actually more discussion between the two, between Paul and Jesus. But this much we know, this much is new that wasn't covered in chapters 9 or 22. So, we've got a few minutes left. Question is, how did Paul address Agrippa? Yes. Okay. Right. It could be everything. You're right. You're right. It's true. There is. This time, yes.
So here's an opportunity for Paul to share some information. We're going to find out later that this was enough to almost convince people that they should become a Christian.
That's right.
So, there's so much that's happening here. Certainly Paul provided the defense,
Mhm.
but the Holy Spirit's working through this. You asked earlier, who's in charge? God's in charge. He's been in charge from the beginning.
Okay, all right. Good point.
He's working to his end, what he wanted to happen, what he wanted to occur. So now these things are starting to move forward.
Mhm.
Anyways, I think there's some great things here that we're seeing the Holy Spirit working.
If I remember correctly, Jesus told his the inner circle of disciples not to prepare ahead of time the things that they would say. If you've got this mental speech ready, it may be geared toward one person or one set of people rather than you may find yourself in front of a different person or a different set of people, and it's not really going to apply. So leave yourselves open to allow the Holy Spirit to guide you in what you say. Okay, good point. Thank you. Okay, so how did Paul address Agrippa? Well, first, how did everybody remember Tertullus? Okay, he spoke for the Jews when they were before Felix. And what did Tertullus do? Tried to flatter his way into a judgment against Paul. Tried to flatter Felix in such a way that it would convince Felix that Paul was guilty. Paul doesn't do that. Paul doesn't say, doesn't use a lot of flowery words. Paul doesn't say, also, Tertullus said, we're going to get straight to the point. Paul doesn't say that. Paul says in chapter 26, verse 3, at the end, he says, at the end of verse 3, he says, therefore, I beg you to hear me patiently. He's not going to flatter him. He's going to give him the truth, and it's going to take a little while. So he basically asks, give me a little time, and I will tell you everything. Okay? He also does admit that Agrippa is an expert in all customs and questions among the Jews. And how does Paul react to this? Does this displease Paul? No. Paul is happy about this. Paul is a Jew. Agrippa is a Jew. Finally, he's standing before someone who understands what Jewish society is like. He stood before Lysias, he stood before Felix, he stood before Festus, all Romans, and now he's finally got a chance to talk to someone from his own country. All right. We will pick up there with what religious views Agrippa held next week. Any comments or questions before we close? Okay, that's where we will pick up next week. Thank you.